This video will demonstrate the supine log roll by 3 providers onto a longboard. The first provider maintains neutral inline stabilization of the patient's head and neck. A second provider measures for and applies the appropriately sized cervical collar. The third provider places the longboard near the patient. While the first provider maintains neutral inline stabilization, the second provider kneels at the patient's side mid-thorax, while the third provider kneels on the same side between the patient's hips and knees. The patient's arms are straightened and placed palms in next to the torso, while the patient's legs are brought into neutral alignment. The second provider reaches over the patient and places one hand under the patient's shoulder and the other hand under the patient's hip, while the third provider reaches over the patient and places one hand under the patient's chest and their other hand under the patient's femur. At no time should the patient's clothing be used to grip and move the patient. On command from the first provider, the patient's entire body is log-rolled as a unit slightly onto the patient's side, while neutral spinal alignment is ensured. The longboard is moved into place behind the patient by the second and third providers, while holding the patient on the side with the foot end of the board positioned between the patient's knees and ankles, and the head of the longboard extended beyond the patient's head. The longboard is held against the patient's back by the second and third providers. On command from the first provider, the patient and the board are rotated to the ground. Once the board is on the ground, the patient's upper chest is grasped firmly by the second provider, with the hands placed in the patient's axilla. The third provider places his or her hands on either side of the patient's pelvis. On command from the first provider, the patient is moved upward and laterally and centered onto the longboard. Neutral inline stabilization is maintained without pulling on the patient's head and neck. Buttress material is placed under the patient's head to maintain neutral alignment. The patient can now be secured to the board with padding to fill all voids.